Welcome back to A Year of Final Fantasy, and now we're going to be talking about the epilogue of the month of Leviathan. And what I'm talking about is something that I figured I'd have played at some point, seeing how much I do love Final Fantasy IV, but that's just really not the case. Final Fantasy IV The After Years, and Final Fantasy IV is the first game in our journey to get this proper sequel. Now, to be clear, this isn't the first Final Fantasy game to have a sequel, just being released in general. That honor belongs to another game. However, in this particular project, since we're going through the games sequentially, this is the first one that we've encountered that does have its own proper sequel, if that makes any sense. So, seeing as Final Fantasy IV is one of, if not my favorite Final Fantasy game, I feel really bad for not having played this, but I haven't. I actually haven't played the sequel to Final Fantasy IV. That is, not until this past week. So, I figured there would be no better time to dive in, and then with my current love of Final Fantasy IV being at an all-time high while working on this project. So, does it disappoint like a lot of sequels do? Well, let's go through some of the basics before I give my own take on the game. Final Fantasy IV The After Years is just such an oddity, seeing as how many years had passed after the game's initial release. Final Fantasy IV came out in 1991 in Japan and in the US, and then 17 years later, Square announces a sequel seemingly out of nowhere. It arrived as a mobile game in Japan on 2008, and it was released as episodic installments. Now, whether or not I was out of the Final Fantasy loop at the time, I was still in college, and I don't really think I was any more out of the loop than I am now. It just really came as a huge surprise to me that they would announce a sequel to such an old game, even though I loved it, just as much then as I do now. I remember when Square did announce this, I heard that it was going to be coming to the Wii, and I was just completely floored, as I hadn't really imagined anything like this would ever happen. I mean, nobody that I knew saw this coming. As the initial chapter launched, I decided I'd hold off until the entire game had been released. Well, life has a way of letting things get lost in the mix, and I just really never got around to playing it, and it's just that simple. That is, again, like I said, until recently. So the game itself follows the second generation of the cast of characters that we saw in Final Fantasy IV. Now, they're not all the children of those characters. We do have some new characters, but generally, it does follow about 15 or so years after the original game. So we see a lot of many classic returning characters, and we're also introduced to several more new faces, of whom, like I said, take a major part in this story. And to keep the spoilers of Final Fantasy IV to a minimum, I'll just briefly explain some of the newcomers to the Final Fantasy IV setting. So our first biggest character, at least what the game starts off with, is Theodore Harvey, who is the son of Rosa and Cecil. Ursula is the next character, who's the daughter of the great monk Yang. We have the Eblin Four, which are disciples of the Ninja Edge, each of which are focused on a specific different element. I really like that. Hurley, who's the ambitious secretary of Edward, and there's also an unnamed girl that's been roaming around, and she has a striking resemblance to Rydia. Of course, the last one that at least I'm going to talk about is Mid, who's the grandson of the great engineer Cid. Now, I don't know if I necessarily like that naming. I don't think they really kind of stretch their brains too much on that, but whatever. Throughout the game, Final Fantasy IV The After Years, we get to see the aftermath of the ending of Final Fantasy IV, which is a really awesome thing in sequels to games if they're done right. And I have to say that in this game, it is done incredibly well. There's a lot of very cool world building and progression that we get to see that you don't normally see with JRPGs like this, so I really enjoy that touch. It's always fun to see how heroes of the classic story return in various ways, and how they've grown since they've become, 15 years older, so they're quite a bit older, I would say. The sense of progression of life in each of these characters is incredibly well done. Of course, it wouldn't be much of a game if it was just, here's how everybody's living happily ever after. That would provide no conflict, and thus, you really wouldn't have a game. So, we do have a very, very cool story that takes place afterwards, and I think the best part about it is that you actually get to see recurring themes from the original game come back in this game, and you get to see them take form with these characters that we've known well. And I know that sounds kind of vague, and I'm intentionally being vague because I do think it's really important that if you want to see these themes, play the game yourself. It's very good. And you don't actually even have to play Final Fantasy IV to get a good experience of a game, but to get the full experience, I would definitely play the original game first. So, while much of it's brand new, not all of it is, and the fascinating part is to see how those events that are familiar and similar from the first game are happening now to famous characters, like I said, whereas in the first game, you basically just accepted that X happened. You're just given that in the story, like this person has been mind controlled or something like that. But you don't really ever get any backstory or reason of how that person got themselves into these events. And it's actually really cool to see here because you're very connected with the main characters. And now that that particular event that may have happened in the first game is happening again, you actually get to see how that character initially falls into this maybe entrapment, if we're going to talk about one specific event. And I'm really keeping it vague because I don't want to spoil anything. And I'm going to take a little self-indulgence here and tell you that maybe, I guess the reason I'm enjoying this game so much is that it's the premise of the next generation. It's incredibly similar to my favorite TV show of all time, Legend of Korra.
Julie, do the thing!
I'm afraid there are no more things to do.
Which follows the next generation of characters from Avatar: The Last Airbender, although in this Final Fantasy IV After Years, it's a much shorter amount of time, but it still has that same flow to it. We get to see these new characters come together and have their own story while seeing the older characters deal with the life that they've created for themselves after the original story. Just really enjoy that. Now, a little bit more info about the creation of After Years came while the team was actually recreating Final Fantasy IV for the DS, the 3D version. There are interviews which are pretty interesting comparing Final Fantasy IV to the Star Wars franchise, and you can actually probably make out a lot of what they were thinking from Final Fantasy IV when you relate it back to Star Wars. And it's really kind of funny that the director Takashi Takeda likened the After Years to the Star Wars prequels. Now, what I think he means here is just a general idea of how to incorporate story points to a series that has already existed for a little while. So Final Fantasy After Years doesn't have that prequel feel in the sense of like there's a Jar Jar and everyone hates everything and green screens and all of that. I just think he's talking about how much time has passed between the two different installments of Star Wars, or in this case, the game Final Fantasy IV. And while much of the game's world is familiar to the players of the original, there are a lot of radically new ideas of mechanics that have been added to it, especially in battle. This game now has something they call bands, which allow two or more characters to attack together with a unique attack. Think of maybe Palom and Porum's twin cast in the original game, only now it's available to a multitude of different characters. Actually, to clarify, I guess even further, it's very similar to Chrono Trigger's dual and triple text. And beyond that, there's also this phase of the moon mechanic that they have, which advances as you rest. And these phases actually enhance and nerf white magic, black magic, and physical attacks depending on what phase of the moon you're in. So personally, I enjoy it, but I can see that it could possibly be annoying to some people, which, is just another layer that they really didn't need to add. So as far as releases go, like I said, this came out in Japan in 2008 on mobile phones, and the next year in 2009, it came out to the Wii in the West. As it did on the mobile phones, it also came out in episodes as well. On those systems, the game features an older look. Think of a maybe Final Fantasy IV on the Game Boy Advance, that kind of look. But in 2011, we received the glorious Final Fantasy IV Complete for the PSP with updated graphics and the entire game, all along with the original Final Fantasy IV, and there's a brand new interlude scenario that connects the two games. Now, if you watch my Final Fantasy IV video, you already know that this is, in my opinion, the best version of Final Fantasy IV and of Final Fantasy IV The After Years. So the complete PSP version of the game is absolutely the one you want to get if any way possible. It is available on the Vita store, on the PSP store. You can buy it digitally, which is how I have it. It's absolutely worth it if you want to get the best experience of both Final Fantasy IV and the After Year. However, Square didn't really see it that way, and like Final Fantasy III and IV for the DS, the After Years got that same 3D treatment and was eventually put up on the iOS and Android in 2013, as well as the most recent Steam release in 2015, just a few years ago. And like I said about Final Fantasy IV, those versions are okay, they're fine, but I just really, really wish they would have made the PSP version the premiere version instead of these 3D remakes. But again, that's just me. Square may have some different numbers that say that the 3D versions of the game sell more, and that's fine. But anyway, regardless of how you play it, I definitely would recommend this game to you. If you haven't decided to play it yet, you looked at it and you're like, well, okay, that may be alright. And maybe you know that some of the other Final Fantasy sequels may have not held your attention and you really don't want to waste your time with this. I say give Final Fantasy IV The After Years a try and you may be pleasantly surprised like I was. So there it is, guys. We capped off another month and we're going to send Leviathan on his way. We made it, and I very much enjoyed putting all of these videos together this month. It really did rekindle the love that I have for Final Fantasy IV, and I had a blast with these franchise lore type of topics that we've gotten a lot of this month. But like I said, it's time to send Leviathan off in style as we approach the month of May, calling forth Diablos, where we'll talk more about the games mixed with a little lore, and of course the game of the month is Final Fantasy V. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.